this Oreo experiment that was done. At some point, I'd love to talk to the other Nick about it too. So basically, I think Lane Norton covered this in a video. A few people have covered this in a video. This experiment, and obviously, people can just refer to your podcast that you just had released on this to get the in-depth information. But what was interesting was it seems like he's in med school now, PhD as well, Nick Norwitz, who had done this experiment where he was doing a ketogenic diet for inflammatory bowel disease. His LDL skyrocketed, and then he ate Oreos essentially for 2 weeks, and it dramatically brought down his LDL more than twice as much as the statins did when he basically did a washout period, took statins, which I think it was 70% lowering versus maybe in mid 30s, something like that. So according to them, they expected this, right? This kind of fits into their model. I know that Peter Tia strongly believes that even if somebody is a lean mass hyperresponder, maybe I should back up and kind of define that. So again, for people who are coming into this relatively new, there seemed to be a category of people, and I fall into this. So I have done multiple ketogenic experiments as well as one carnivore experiment where my LDL got into the 200s on keto, but into like the mid 300s on carnivore. This was while still having high HDL, low triglycerides, low CRP, the inflammatory markers were all good, all of that. And it seems like that is, I don't know the number, the percentage. It's actually a lower percentage than I expected. Do you know offhand how many they said people were lean mass hyperresponders when doing such a diet?
I remember so I'm going to have a part two to the segment that you're talking about, the
Okay.
podcast that you're talking about. And Dave Feldman talks about it, but I think it's like don't quote me on this, but it's like one in like 1,000 or something like that. It might
Really?
even be less than that, actually.
Oh, okay. I,
Yeah.
I was thinking it was like closer to 10%. Because it seems like I mean, again, when you're talking online, obviously the potential population of people is very large, but
Mm,
I certainly seem to fall into that category myself. So,
mm.
and there's basically discussion, and I would have to think that when you look at you want to call it the metabolic profile, when you look at the overall blood work of somebody who has high LDL with low HDL, triglycerides off the charts, inflammatory markers are high. Obviously, that is a very different person and a very different, I would say, when you're looking at like overall risk factors, it's obviously a much higher risk individual than somebody who only exclusively has LDL. But does that mean that the LDL component itself is any less risky? I mean, obviously, I don't know the answer to that. I think Peter would argue it is just as risky. So, I mean, did you get a sense after talking with them that they're more in the category of we just don't know yet, or do they really feel like, no, this is not going to be a problem for those individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit tricky. So obviously I lean again towards Dr. Atia's perspective. However, I think that I think that we need to be pretty open-minded to this situation. Um, Actually, we need to be completely open-minded to this situation. I don't necessarily agree with, I haven't heard Dr. Atia talk about this to any great degree, so you're more educated than I am on that topic. But if he in any way says that we should, dismiss this and say, oh, well, they're definitely at risk and whatnot, I think that would be short-sighted because I think that we need to okay, so I'm gonna kind of break this down in terms of like how I understand it.
Yeah.
If in the big picture of things, we take these massive data sets, we take, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that we put together, plot together from all these studies looking at LDL, looking at ApoB, and we end up creating these patterns. And it's not just when people think of like correlations, right? They think of correlation is not causation, which is absolutely true and whatnot. But correlation studies give us strong indications of what to kind of chase, what to look at
Yeah.
in more depth and try to create causation. And these correlation studies there have been stronger and stronger statistical models that we can start to use to start to separate out different groups of people. So, for example, like you pointed out, high triglycerides, low HDL, maybe have high blood sugar, like these kinds of different metrics that are kind of ancillary to the whole LDL situation, but they also have high LDL. Well, these statistical models can now start to separate out groups of people that have low blood sugar, high HDL, have low triglycerides, but have high LDL, and they still show that there's risk associated with having this LDL. So that's just one. There's multiple lines of evidence that indicate that LDL is this risk factor. So that's kind of the general idea of how we got to LDL being a risk factor, along with many, many other studies that I won't go into. But the thing with lean mass hyperresponders is that is such a subset of individuals that they could get lost in this sea of overall data. So I think that it would be, I think my perspective is that it's unfair to immediately characterize these people as being at risk if we don't have any specific data to these individuals because they have this such a stark phenotype. They have such a dramatic difference in their blood profiles, this high LDL, high HDL, very low triglycerides, and tend to be leaner individuals. So it's possible that in this sea of data that we're missing this subset of individuals, that we need to carve out this additional study population and see if truly they are also at risk, just like everybody else.
Right.
So from Dr. Atia's standpoint, I completely understand. And I fall into that mentality of, for now, we need to base things off of what the current evidence says. But if Dave Feldman and Nick Norowitz were able to show that LDL is not a risk factor for these individuals, then I would be absolutely on board and say, oh, yes, then there's an exception to the rule. But one of the problems that I have with the experience with the study that they're doing is that there are a few weaknesses to the study that I feel like even when the study publishes, because of these inherent weaknesses, I would need to have more proof to indicate truly that these individuals are risk-free from this LDL issue, which I think Dave might disagree with me on that front.
So I actually only just briefly saw a clip, but it basically Dave Feldman was on Atia's podcast years ago,
Okay.
and I believe there was quite a bit of debate there. And basically, Atia saying that he was only a little open to the model, and after talking with Dave Feldman, he was even less open to the model. But I'd have to go and listen to like the whole podcast. I actually your podcast with them is still on my playlist. I've only gotten a little bit in so far. Could you just briefly tell me what that experiment that they're running is that you would then later need to see a little bit more?
Yeah. So the podcast where I broke it up into two parts, but on my podcast platform, I'm going to be combining them both. So the first part that I already have public that you're currently listening to is the Oreo experiment. That is a single person case study, and that does not tell us anything about risk. It just tells us about this interesting phenomenon that you described at the 70% drop in LDL, but it doesn't speak anything to the actual risk.